The private jet gleamed under the Atlanta sun, its sleek body worth $220 million, connected to a $22 billion government contract that would reshape everything. Tamara Washington stood at the base of the stairs, her hand resting on the gold railing, and turned back one final time. Across the security fence, Bethany Clarke stood frozen, her designer suit rumpled, an ankle monitor visible beneath her hem. Their eyes met. No words passed between them. Tamara smiled, turned, and climbed aboard. The engines roared to life, drowning out whatever Bethany might have screamed. 6 months ago, Bethany had stolen everything from Tamara using the oldest weapon in corporate America, racism disguised as concern. Now, Tamara was flying away with the empire she'd built, while Bethany watched through chain link, waiting for her trial date. Before we dive into how this incredible reversal happened, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Are you Team Tamara or do you think there's more to this story? Hit that like button and subscribe because this tale of corporate warfare, hidden prejudice, and ultimate justice is about to take you on a ride you won't forget. Let's go back 6 months and see exactly how a white woman almost destroyed a black CEO, and how that CEO took back everything, plus interest. 6 months earlier, Atlanta's skyline glittered beneath Tamara Washington's corner office on the 35th floor of TechAero Solutions headquarters. At 42 years old, she'd spent 15 years clawing her way through an industry that loved to slam doors in black women's faces. Her natural coils framed a face that had learned to show confidence even when doubt whispered in her ear at 3 in the morning. At 5 feet 8 inches, she commanded rooms not through height but through the kind of presence you can't buy at leadership seminars. MIT had given her the engineering degree. The aerospace industry had given her the scars. And TechAero, the company she'd grown from a struggling startup into a $3 billion giant, had given her the proof that she belonged at the top. The morning sun caught the glass and steel of downtown Atlanta as Tamara prepared for the board meeting that would define the next phase of her company's evolution. Her office reflected both her journey and her vision. African art from her grandmother's collection mixed with cutting-edge technology displays, a photo of her late husband beside one of their son Devin in his prep school uniform, and the MIT diploma that had cost her 4 years of being the only black woman in most of her engineering classes. She'd fought for this view, this office, this moment. TechAero had just closed a $500 million contract with the Department of Defense, and Tamara's strategic vision had positioned them to swallow their biggest competitor, Aero Global, in a $1.8 billion acquisition that would rocket them into the top tier of aerospace technology firms. The boardroom filled with the usual faces. Harold Brennan, the 65-year-old white chairman who'd been her mentor and champion since she'd pitched him her first prototype in a coffee shop 12 years ago, Yvonne Patel, the 50-year-old Indian-American finance wizard who'd structured every major deal TechAero had ever done, Gerald Morris, 58, one of the few other black executives at this level, who'd warned her more than once that success made you a target. And 9 others, mostly white, mostly male, mostly older than her. The composition wasn't unusual for corporate America. What was unusual was that Tamara sat at the head of the table, and they listened when she spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tamara began, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made people lean in rather than tune out, "we have an opportunity to reshape this industry. Aero Global has been struggling since their CEO retired. Their technology division is hemorrhaging talent, their government contracts are up for renewal, and their board is looking for a white knight. We can be that white knight, but we need to move fast and we need to move decisively. The acquisition price is $1.8 billion, which I know sounds aggressive, but let me walk you through why this is the smartest move we'll make this decade." For the next 45 minutes, Tamara commanded that room like a conductor leading an orchestra. Slides flashed across the screen showing projected revenue growth, technology synergies, market share expansion, and the pathway to breaking the $5 billion valuation mark within 18 months. She'd spent 3 months building the relationship with Aero Global's leadership, 2 months stress testing the financial models with Yvonne, and countless late nights making sure every question could be answered, every concern addressed. This was her masterpiece, and she knew it. The vote came quickly, 11 in favor, 1 abstention. Harold Brennan smiled across the table at her, the kind of smile that said he was proud, that he'd known she had this in her all along. Yvonne gave her a small nod of respect. Gerald caught her eye and mouthed, "Careful now." She didn't understand the warning then. She was too busy riding the high of victory, too focused on the future she was building, too confident that competence and results would shield her from the kinds of attacks that had felled other black executives she'd watched from afar. What she didn't notice was the woman sitting 3 seats down from Harold, the woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes, the woman who clapped politely while her mind churned with resentment and calculation. Bethany Clarke was 38 years old, blonde, blue-eyed, and perfectly groomed in that way that screamed private schools and country clubs and a life where doors opened before you even had to knock. She'd joined TechAero 5 years earlier as Director of Strategic Partnerships, leveraging her father's connection to Harold Brennan to skip past several layers of corporate hierarchy. Within 3 years she'd climbed to VP of Operations, a role that gave her visibility and influence but not the ultimate prize she craved. Bethany had grown up believing that success was her birthright, that leadership was a matter of looking the part and knowing the right people. Watching Tamara Washington, a black woman who'd started with nothing and built everything, sit in the chair Bethany felt should be hers created a burning resentment that metastasized into something far uglier. As the board meeting concluded and executives filed out discussing lunch plans and golf schedules, Bethany lingered in the hallway outside the boardroom. Through the glass wall, she watched Tamara gather her materials, exchange a few words with Harold, and walk toward the elevator with the confidence of someone who just won big and knew it. Bethany's fingers tightened around the folder she carried until her knuckles went white. The thought that crawled through her mind wasn't conscious prejudice, at least not the kind she'd ever admit to herself. It was wrapped in the language of meritocracy and tradition, coded in concerns about leadership style and corporate culture, dressed up in the respectable clothes of business judgment. But at its core, the thought was simple and vicious: she doesn't deserve this, a black woman in that chair while I'm stuck waiting, and I'm going to do something about it. 2 weeks passed in what felt like triumph for Tamara. The press coverage of the Aero Global deal was universally positive. The Wall Street Journal called her a rising star in aerospace. Forbes included her in a feature about transformative CEOs. Her son Devin bragged to his friends that his mom was famous. For those 2 weeks, Tamara let herself believe that excellence was enough, that results spoke louder than the doubts people carried about whether someone who looked like her belonged at the top. She should have known better. Gerald had warned her. Her own experience should have taught her. But success has a way of making you forget that not everyone celebrates when you win. Bethany Clarke understood that direct attacks don't work in modern corporate America. You can't walk into a board meeting and say you want the black CEO replaced with someone white. You can't send an email saying the problem is race. The art of corporate sabotage in the 21st century requires subtlety, requires code words, requires plausible deniability. So Bethany began her campaign not with a bang but with a whisper, and she started with the board members she knew would be most receptive to concerns about tradition, stability, and whether Tamara was really the right fit for where the company needed to go next. Richard Caldwell sat across from Bethany at Capitol Grill, one of Atlanta's premier steakhouses where executives went to be seen making deals. At 61, Richard was a former CEO himself, a man who'd built his career in an era when boardrooms were all white and all male and nobody questioned whether that was a problem. He'd voted for Tamara's initiatives because the numbers were good, but Bethany knew he harbored doubts about whether the industry was changing too fast, whether diversity was being prioritized over what he called traditional qualifications. Over $40 steaks and $100 wine, Bethany planted her first seeds with the skill of someone who'd learned from watching her father navigate corporate politics for 4 decades. "Richard, I wanted to get your read on something," Bethany said, her voice carrying just the right mix of concern and deference. "I'm worried about the Aero Global deal. Don't get me wrong, I respect Tamara, truly I do. But I've been hearing some things from our international partners, and I think we might have a challenge brewing that nobody's talking about." She paused, letting the silence do its work, watching Richard lean in with interest. Some of our contacts in Europe and the Middle East have expressed concerns about leadership continuity, about whether we're the right cultural fit for their needs. They didn't say it directly, but there were questions about Tamara's style, about whether she has the right kind of experience to navigate these more traditional business cultures. The beauty of what Bethany was doing lay in what she didn't say. She never mentioned race. She never said Tamara was unqualified. She used words like cultural fit and traditional and leadership style, words that sounded reasonable, words that let Richard fill in the blanks with his own biases while Bethany kept her hands clean. Richard's expression shifted from interest to concern, exactly as Bethany had calculated. "That's troubling," he said slowly. "I hadn't heard anything like that, but you're closer to the operational side. If our partners are having doubts, we need to address that before it becomes a bigger problem." Bethany nodded sympathetically, took a sip of wine, and knew she'd just gained her first ally. Over the next 4 weeks, Bethany repeated versions of this conversation with 6 more board members. She met Preston Montgomery at Atlanta Country Club, a golf course where the membership was 98% white and old money, where deals were made on the back nine and careers were ended in the locker room. Preston, 59 and wealthy from tech investments made in the 90s, listened as Bethany expressed worries about whether Tamara had been promoted too fast, whether the board had been so focused on diversity metrics that they'd overlooked questions about readiness for the CEO role. "I'm all for giving everyone a fair shot," Bethany said with practiced earnestness, "but at some point we have to ask if we're setting people up for failure by putting them in positions they're not quite ready for. Tamara's brilliant, nobody disputes that, but is brilliant enough when you're dealing with $1.8 billion acquisitions and relationships with foreign governments." The poison spread slowly, carefully, always wrapped in concern for the company rather than attacks on Tamara herself. Bethany knew that 7 votes out of 12 was all she needed, and by the end of week 6, she'd identified her coalition, Richard, Preston, and 5 others who ranged from openly skeptical of Tamara to quietly uncomfortable with how much power she'd accumulated. None of them would have admitted to racial bias. They would have been genuinely offended by the accusation. But Bethany had given them permission to doubt Tamara's competence, had provided them with respectable-sounding reasons to question her leadership, had created a narrative where removing her was about protecting the company rather than protecting their own comfort with traditional power structures. Sitting in her car after her final recruitment conversation, Bethany pulled out her phone and looked at her list of board members. 7 names now had check marks next to them. 7 votes. More than enough. She allowed herself a small smile, started the engine of her Mercedes, and began planning her next move. The whisper campaign had worked. Now it was time to take the attack public, to create a crisis that would give the board an excuse to act, to push Tamara out in a way that looked like reasonable business judgment rather than what it really was. The latest chapter in the oldest story in American corporate life, the story of white comfort reasserting itself when black excellence got too close to real power. The email arrived on a Monday morning while Tamara was reviewing financial projections for the Aero Global integration. "Emergency board meeting, 2 p.m. today," was all it said, sent from Harold Brennan's assistant with no agenda attached, no explanation provided, just a mandatory attendance notice that made Tamara's stomach clench with the first real warning that something was wrong. In 12 years of working with Harold, she'd never received a notice like this. Board meetings were scheduled months in advance. Emergency sessions happened for crises, for disasters, for moments when the company faced existential threats. Tamara ran through the possibilities as she called Harold's direct line: regulatory investigation, major client loss, sudden market crash affecting their stock price. What she didn't consider, what she couldn't imagine despite Gerald's warnings and her own experiences, was that she was the crisis. Harold's voice was tight when he answered, careful in a way that immediately told Tamara he wasn't alone. "Tamara, yes, there's a board meeting this afternoon. Some members have raised concerns about company direction that need to be addressed. I think it's best we discuss it with everyone present." The words were professional, neutral, but Tamara heard the tension beneath them. Harold, what concerns? Why wasn't I consulted before an emergency meeting was called? There was a pause, the sound of a door closing, and then Harold's voice dropped lower. Bethany has been talking to board members. I don't know everything she's been saying, but I know she's built some kind of coalition. Tamara, you need to be prepared for this to get difficult. I'm on your side, but I'm not sure how many votes you have right now. The next 4 hours passed in a blur of preparation and mounting dread. Tamara pulled every piece of data she had on company performance, on the Aero Global deal, on client satisfaction and employee retention and revenue growth. She called Yvonne and Gerald, both of whom confirmed they'd also been blindsided by the meeting notice. This is a setup, Gerald said flatly. Bethany's been making moves. I heard whispers about it last week but didn't think she'd gotten this far this fast. Tamara, you need to understand what you're walking into. This isn't about business performance. This is about power, and about people who aren't comfortable with you having it. Tamara wanted to argue, wanted to believe that results mattered more than prejudice, but the knot in her stomach told her Gerald was right. Walking into that boardroom at 2 o'clock felt like walking into an ambush, because that's exactly what it was. The usual casual atmosphere was gone, replaced by a tension so thick Tamara could taste it. Board members who normally greeted her warmly now offered only brief nods or avoided eye contact entirely. Bethany sat not in her usual seat but positioned strategically next to Richard Caldwell and Preston Montgomery, her laptop open, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Harold looked uncomfortable at the head of the table. Yvonne and Gerald sat together, their expressions grim. Tamara took her seat, placed her folder of materials on the table, and looked around at faces she thought she knew. Harold, what's this about? Harold cleared his throat, glanced at Bethany, and began in a tone that was too formal, too rehearsed. Tamara, several board members have expressed concerns about the strategic direction of the company, particularly regarding the Aero Global acquisition and some questions about leadership approach. We felt it was important to address these concerns directly and comprehensively. Before Tamara could respond, before she could ask what concerns or who had raised them, Bethany jumped in with the confidence of someone who'd been planning this moment for weeks. If I may, Harold, she said, standing up and moving to the front of the room where a projector screen descended from the ceiling. I've prepared a presentation that I think will help frame the discussion. The first slide appeared. Leadership Assessment, Risk Analysis. Tamara felt ice water flood her veins. Bethany hadn't just been whispering to board members. She'd built an entire case, complete with PowerPoint slides and carefully selected data points designed to make Tamara look reckless, incompetent, dangerous to the company's future. For the next 20 minutes, Bethany systematically attacked every major decision Tamara had made in the past year, reframing success as luck and strategic vision as dangerous gambling. The Aero Global deal, which the board had approved just 6 weeks ago, was suddenly described as overly aggressive, insufficiently vetted, based on relationships rather than rigorous analysis. $1.8 billion is an enormous commitment, Bethany said, her voice dripping with false concern. And while I know Tamara has built a relationship with Aero Global's leadership, we have to ask ourselves, is relationship enough? Do we have the systems, the oversight, the experienced leadership to execute an acquisition of this magnitude? Tamara's hands clenched beneath the table as she listened to what was really being said beneath the corporate language. Bethany was questioning whether Tamara had the experience, the judgment, the capability to lead Tech Aero through complex deals. But more than that, she was signaling to the board that they'd made a mistake, that they'd let diversity initiatives cloud their judgment, that they'd put someone in the CEO chair who didn't really belong there. When Bethany clicked to the next slide, labeled, Internal Concerns and Leadership Style, Tamara knew the attack was about to get personal. I've spoken with several employees and clients, Bethany continued, her voice steady and reasonable, and there are concerns about leadership style that I think we need to address. Some people have described Tamara's approach as aggressive, as intimidating, as creating an environment where people don't feel comfortable raising concerns or pushing back on decisions. Tamara shot to her feet, unable to contain herself any longer. What people? What concerns? I haven't received a single formal complaint about my leadership style. If employees have issues, there are proper channels. This is the first I'm hearing of any of this. Bethany's smile was patient, almost pitying. And that's exactly the problem, Tamara. Some people don't feel comfortable using those channels when they're worried about how you might react. They've come to me because they felt they had nowhere else to go. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Bethany was using one of the oldest racist tropes in the book, the angry black woman, the intimidating black woman, the black woman who made white people uncomfortable and therefore must be doing something wrong. Tamara looked around the table and saw the impact immediately. Preston Montgomery nodded slowly, as if something now made sense. Richard Caldwell's expression had shifted to concern. Even some of the board members who'd supported her looked uncertain, as if maybe there was something they'd missed, something that explained why Bethany was raising these issues. "This is ridiculous," Tamara said, fighting to keep her voice level despite the rage building in her chest. "I've led this company through 3 successful acquisitions. Our stock price is up 40% since I became CEO. Employee satisfaction scores are at an all-time high. Client retention is at 97%. What exactly is the concern here?" Bethany's response was measured, calculated, and devastating in its implications. "Nobody is questioning your abilities, Tamara. You're brilliant, everyone knows that. But there's a difference between being brilliant and being the right fit for this particular phase of the company's evolution. We're about to take on massive new challenges, enter markets we've never competed in before, manage relationships at a level of complexity we haven't seen. Some of us are wondering if perhaps a different leadership structure might serve the company better. Maybe a co-CEO model, or perhaps transitioning you to a role where your strategic vision can shine without the day-to-day operational pressures." Tamara stared at Bethany, finally seeing clearly what was happening. This wasn't about performance or strategy or leadership style. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign to remove her from power, wrapped in language that sounded reasonable but was really about one simple fact: Bethany and her allies didn't believe a black woman should be sitting in that chair. "What you're proposing," Tamara said slowly, her voice shaking with controlled fury, "is that I step aside for someone you consider more appropriate for dealing with traditional business cultures and more comfortable for people to work with. Let me ask directly, Bethany, more appropriate how? More comfortable how? What exactly are you saying?" Bethany's mask slipped for just a moment, a flash of triumph in her eyes before she composed herself. "I'm saying we need leadership that can navigate the complexities ahead. I'm saying we need someone who can make our partners and our team feel confident and secure. I'm saying we need stability." Tamara looked her dead in the eye and said what everyone in that room was thinking but nobody wanted to say out loud. "You mean you need someone white?" The room exploded. Preston Montgomery shouted that bringing race into it was inappropriate and unprofessional. Richard Caldwell insisted this was purely about business judgment. Bethany put on a show of being hurt and offended, claiming she'd always supported Tamara and couldn't believe she was being accused of racism. But in the chaos, Tamara saw the truth reflected in some board members' faces. She'd said what they didn't want acknowledged, had named the thing they wanted to pretend didn't exist, had forced them to confront what this really was. Harold called for order, his face flushed with anger and distress, and proposed that they form a special committee to conduct a formal 90-day review of CEO performance and leadership structure. The vote that followed told Tamara everything she needed to know: 7 in favor, 5 opposed. Bethany had her coalition, and Tamara's time was running out. The weeks that followed the emergency board meeting felt like dying by 1,000 cuts. Bethany didn't need to stage another dramatic confrontation. She'd achieved what she wanted: official sanction to question everything Tamara did, permission to second-guess every decision, the appearance of legitimate oversight that masked what was really systematic undermining. Tamara would send an email approving a budget allocation, and within an hour Bethany would send a follow-up message CC'd to the entire board asking for clarification on the rationale, questioning whether the spend was necessary, suggesting alternative approaches that just happened to contradict Tamara's judgment. Every email felt like a public challenge to her authority, every suggestion felt like a vote of no confidence, and worst of all, people started responding to Bethany's emails while leaving Tamara's unanswered. In staff meetings, Bethany perfected the art of what corporate consultants call whitesplaining. She'd let Tamara speak, then immediately rephrase everything Tamara had just said as if the team hadn't understood it the first time, subtly positioning herself as the one who really knew what was happening while Tamara was just a figurehead losing her grip. What Tamara means, Bethany would say with a condescending smile, is that we need to prioritize Q3 deliverables, and here's how I think we should structure that. The first few times it happened, Tamara called it out directly, but that just made her look defensive and insecure. Eventually she fell silent, watching as her own team started looking to Bethany for direction while she sat at the head of the table becoming invisible. The isolation was methodical and devastating. Department heads who used to meet with Tamara weekly suddenly had scheduling conflicts, only to be spotted having lunch with Bethany the same day. Client calls that Tamara had managed for years were suddenly being handed off to Bethany to share the load, which really meant to cut Tamara out of relationships she'd built from scratch. One afternoon Tamara walked into the executive cafeteria and found herself standing alone with her tray while 20 feet away, Bethany sat at the center of a table surrounded by senior leaders, all of them laughing at something she'd said. The message was clear. Pick your side, and the winning side was gathering around the white woman who promised a return to comfortable, traditional leadership. The real crisis hit in month 2 when AeroGlobal's CEO, Gregory Nash, called to express concerns about leadership stability at Tech Aero. Someone had leaked information about the board's special committee and the questions being raised about Tamara's performance. Gregory, a 60-something white executive who'd built his career in the old boys network of aerospace defense, asked pointed questions about whether Tamara would still be CEO when the deal closed, whether there might be better alignment with different leadership, whether perhaps it made sense to have someone else take point on finalizing the acquisition. The conversation was professional and polite, but Tamara heard what he wasn't saying. He was more comfortable dealing with Bethany. He had doubts about Tamara's authority now that her own board was questioning her, and he wanted reassurance that looked a lot like replacing Tamara with someone who looked like him. When Harold Brennan called Tamara into his office later that week, she knew what was coming before he said a word. "Tamara, I need you to consider something," he began, not meeting her eyes. "The AeroGlobal deal is at risk. Gregory has concerns, some of our own board members are getting nervous, and Bethany has offered to take over the negotiations to smooth things out. I think maybe, just for this deal, it makes sense to let her be the primary point of contact." Tamara felt something break inside her chest. "Harold, I've spent 2 years building the relationship with Gregory. I know every detail of this deal. I've negotiated every major term. And now you want me to step aside and let Bethany take credit for my work?" Harold looked miserable but determined. "I want you to protect yourself. Right now the board is looking for any excuse to say you can't execute. If this deal falls apart with you in charge, they'll use it against you. If Bethany brings it home, at least the company succeeds even if you don't get the credit." The meeting with Gregory Nash 2 weeks later was one of the most humiliating experiences of Tamara's professional life. She'd prepared for months, knew every number, every contingency, every concern Gregory might raise. But Bethany showed up uninvited, positioned herself as co-lead on the deal, and proceeded to dominate the conversation while Gregory directed almost all his attention to her. When Tamara proposed modifications to the payment structure that would save Tech Aero $50 million, Gregory looked at Bethany and asked, "What do you think, Ms. Clarke? Does that work from your perspective?" As if Tamara's analysis needed Bethany's white approval before it could be taken seriously. By the end of the meeting, it was clear who Gregory saw as his real counterpart, and it wasn't the black woman who'd actually architected the deal. Driving back to the office, Tamara finally confronted Bethany directly. "What are you doing? Why are you trying so hard to destroy me? Bethany's mask of professionalism slipped just enough to reveal the ugliness beneath. "I'm not destroying you, Tamara. I'm saving this company from your mistakes. You were a diversity hire who got lucky, and now you're in over your head. Someone needs to step in before you crash this whole thing, and that someone is me. I've been patient, I've been professional, but let's be honest about what this is. You don't belong in that chair, and everyone knows it except you. Has anyone here ever been pushed out of something you earned because of who you are rather than what you've done? Comment number 1 if you've ever felt like Tamara, working twice as hard only to watch someone else take credit and power. Have you seen this kind of subtle discrimination play out in your workplace, where someone uses concerns and professional language to mask prejudice? Drop a like if you're standing with Tamara in this moment, hit subscribe because this story is about to take a turn that nobody saw coming, and stick around to find out what happens when a black woman refuses to go quietly. What Tamara didn't know was that Bethany's attacks were about to extend beyond the boardroom and into the most personal part of her life. The question isn't whether Tamara can save her career anymore. The question is whether she'll be able to protect her family from the woman who's decided that destroying her completely is the only way to win. Tamara Washington had built her career on the belief that if you worked hard enough, if you were excellent enough, if you delivered results that couldn't be denied, you could overcome prejudice through sheer competence. It was a belief her mother had taught her, a belief that had carried her through MIT classrooms where professors assumed she was there on affirmative action rather than merit, through early career jobs where white colleagues got promoted over her despite her superior performance, through the thousands of small indignities that black professionals swallow every day to survive in corporate America. But as month 3 of Bethany's campaign ground on, Tamara began to understand a harder truth. Excellence doesn't protect you when people have decided you don't belong, it just makes them angrier that you're succeeding despite their efforts to stop you. The decision to hire Sofia Delgado, a former FBI agent turned private investigator, felt like both an admission of defeat and a necessary escalation. Tamara met Sofia in a nondescript office building in Midtown Atlanta, away from anywhere she might be recognized, and laid out the situation with the kind of clinical detail that came from years of analyzing business problems. "I need to know what Bethany Clarke is doing behind my back. Phone records if you can get them, tracking her meetings, documentation of who she's talking to and what she's saying. I know she's orchestrating my removal, but I need proof that stands up to scrutiny." Sofia, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s with 20 years of corporate investigation experience, listened carefully and then delivered the bad news. "Without a court order, I can't get phone records or emails legally. What I can do is track her movements, identify who she's meeting with, build a pattern of behavior. But I need to be honest with you, unless she's doing something criminal, most of what you're describing falls into legal territory even if it's morally bankrupt. Corporate politics isn't illegal, even when it's driven by racism." For 2 weeks Sofia followed Bethany's trail through Atlanta's business district, documenting lunch meetings with 6 different board members, dinners with 3 journalists from business publications, and consultations with 2 high-powered attorneys who specialized in executive transitions. The pattern was clear. Bethany was building her case methodically, spreading her narrative to anyone who might influence the outcome, preparing for the final push to remove Tamara from the CEO position. But there was no smoking gun, no recorded conversation where Bethany admitted to racial animus, no email trail explicitly laying out her discriminatory intent. She was too smart for that, too practiced in the art of corporate warfare, too aware that in 21st century America you destroy people with concerns and questions and seemingly reasonable doubts rather than open bigotry. The emergency board meeting came at the end of month 3, scheduled with 72 hours notice and an agenda that made Tamara's stomach drop when she read it: CEO performance review and leadership structure recommendations. Bethany had spent 90 days building her case, and now she was ready to present it formally. The presentation she'd prepared was 40 slides of carefully selected data, misleadingly framed metrics, and ominous warnings about stakeholder confidence. She highlighted every challenge the company faced while downplaying every success, emphasized client concerns while ignoring client praise, and painted a picture of a CEO losing control while the ship headed toward an iceberg. I think the best path forward for TechAero, Bethany said as she reached her final slide, standing at the front of the boardroom with the confidence of someone who'd already won, is to transition Tamara to Chief Strategy Officer, a role where her vision and intellect can continue to benefit the company, while bringing in leadership with more extensive experience managing large-scale integrations and complex stakeholder relationships. She paused, smiled sympathetically in Tamara's direction, and delivered the killing blow with surgical precision. I know this is difficult, but sometimes the strongest leaders are the ones who recognize when it's time to step aside for the good of the organization. Tamara stood up, her hands shaking with rage but her voice steady and clear. This is a coup, and we all know it. For 3 months Bethany has systematically undermined my authority, questioned my competence, and poisoned relationships I spent years building. And I know why. This isn't about performance, it's not about experience, it's not about stakeholder confidence. This is about race. Bethany has spent 3 months running a whisper campaign based on the oldest prejudice in corporate America, the belief that black women are too aggressive, too emotional, too risky, too different to really lead. You're all being played, and you're letting it happen because it's easier than confronting your own discomfort with who's sitting in this chair. Preston Montgomery cut in sharply. Tamara, nobody is questioning your background. The fact that you're making this about race shows exactly the kind of judgment problem we're concerned about. This is about business, nothing else. Bethany jumped on the opening like a shark smelling blood. I can't believe you would accuse me of racism, Tamara. I've supported you, I've tried to help you, and this is how you respond. By playing the race card? That's not leadership, that's desperation. The words race card landed like a slap, and Tamara saw several board members nod in agreement. In that moment she understood she'd lost. Speaking the truth about what was happening had been turned into evidence of her unfitness, her refusal to go quietly had become proof that Bethany was right about her judgment, and her defense of herself had been weaponized against her. The vote came quickly, 7-5 in favor of transitioning Tamara to Chief Strategy Officer and appointing Bethany as interim CEO. Harold Brennan looked like he might be sick. Yvonne Patel and Gerald Morris had voted against it, but they were outnumbered. Tamara gathered her materials, walked out of that boardroom with her head high and her heart shattered, and went home to figure out what came next. 1 week later, the official announcement went out. TechAero was making a leadership transition to better position the company for its next phase of growth. Tamara's corner office was cleaned out and reassigned to Bethany. Her parking space was given to someone else. Her access to certain systems was quietly restricted. And she was moved to a smaller office on the 28th floor, where she could watch the empire she'd built being taken over by the woman who'd destroyed her. But what Tamara didn't know yet, what would change everything, came 3 days after her demotion when her assistant Jenna Holloway knocked hesitantly on her new office door. Jenna was a 28-year-old white woman who'd worked for Tamara for 2 years and had been horrified by what she'd witnessed. Ms. Washington, I need to tell you something, Jenna said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yesterday I was in the executive suite filing some documents and I overheard Bethany on the phone. She was talking to someone about your son, about Devon's college applications. I couldn't hear everything, but she mentioned Stanford specifically, and she said something about making sure there were consequences for your stubbornness. It sounded threatening, like she was planning to hurt his chances somehow. Tamara felt ice flood her veins. Everything that had happened to her professionally, as painful as it was, existed in the world she'd chosen to enter. But Devon was 16 years old, a brilliant kid with dreams of becoming an engineer like his mother, a straight-A student who'd worked his whole life toward getting into a top school like Stanford. If Bethany went after her son, if she tried to damage his future because his mother wouldn't submit quietly to being pushed out, then this had crossed from corporate warfare into something far more personal, far more unforgivable. Tamara looked at Jenna and said quietly, "Thank you for telling me. And Jenna, be careful. If Bethany finds out you warned me, she'll come after you too." That night, while Devon slept peacefully in his room dreaming about college and the future, Tamara sat at her kitchen table and made a decision. she was done playing defense, done trying to survive, done hoping that truth and justice would prevail. It was time to go to war. Bethany Clarke's first month as interim CEO of TechAero Solutions was everything she'd dreamed it would be. The corner office that had been Tamara's was redecorated within a week. Out went the African art and family photos, in came sleek European minimalism, white furniture, abstract paintings that cost a fortune and said nothing. Bethany hired an interior designer who specialized in executive spaces, spent $60,000 of company money on the renovations, and posted carefully staged photos on LinkedIn with captions about new chapters and fresh directions. The message was clear to everyone watching: Tamara Washington's era was over, and Bethany's era had begun. The changes came quickly and deliberately. At her first all-hands staff meeting, Bethany stood before 300 employees and talked about returning to traditional excellence, about stability and proven leadership approaches, about the importance of cultural fit and shared values. To anyone listening carefully, the words were code. Traditional meant white, stability meant no more diversity initiatives pushing people of color into leadership, cultural fit meant hiring people who looked and thought like Bethany. Within 2 weeks she'd put diversity program funding under review. Within 3 weeks she'd eliminated the mentorship program that had been bringing young Black and Hispanic professionals into technical tracks. Within a month she'd laid off 3 senior Black employees, citing restructuring needs, while simultaneously hiring 5 new executives who were all white men with connections to companies where her father sat on boards. Tamara watched it all from her diminished office on the 28th floor, excluded from decision-making, kept out of meetings that mattered, reduced to preparing strategic analyses that nobody read. The humiliation was intended to drive her out completely, to make staying so unbearable that she'd resign and Bethany could claim Tamara had chosen to leave rather than admitting she'd been forced out. But Tamara didn't resign. She came to work every day, documented everything she saw, and quietly began building her case with the help of Sophia Delgado and Clarence Wright, a Black attorney in his 50s who specialized in employment discrimination and executive contracts. But Bethany, drunk on her sudden power and convinced she was untouchable, made her first major mistake by moving too fast and getting too greedy. The Aero Global deal that Tamara had spent 2 years developing was officially cancelled 1 month into Bethany's tenure, with a press release citing strategic misalignment and risk factors. What the press release didn't mention was that Bethany had simultaneously been negotiating with a different company, Skybridge Corporation, to purchase their aerospace division for $1.2 billion. On paper it looked like savvy pivoting: drop a risky deal, pursue a safer opportunity, protect shareholder value. But Sophia Delgado's investigation had uncovered something crucial. Bethany's father, William Clarke, owned an 18% stake in Skybridge Corporation, a fact that was buried in layers of shell companies and trust structures but traceable if you knew where to look. The conflict of interest was staggering. Bethany was steering TechAero toward a massive deal with a company her family had significant financial interest in, and she disclosed none of it to the board. Even worse, Sophia found evidence that Bethany had been receiving consulting fees from Skybridge, payments of $50,000 deposited quarterly into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands that was then wired to an account in Bethany's name. The total payments over the past year, $300,000. It was textbook self-dealing, a violation of fiduciary duty, and depending on how prosecutors looked at it, potentially criminal fraud. Tamara sat in Clarence Wright's office reviewing the documents, feeling her pulse quicken with the first real hope she'd felt in months. "This is enough," Clarence said, spreading the financial records across his conference table. "This is more than enough. Conflict of interest, undisclosed payments, steering company resources to benefit her personal finances. We bring this to the board and she's done. Not just fired, but potentially prosecuted." But the smoking gun that would seal Bethany's fate came from an unexpected source: a former employee named Keisha Robinson who'd been fired by Bethany 6 weeks into her CEO tenure. Keisha was a 35-year-old Black woman who'd worked in business development, a rising star who'd been on track for VP until Bethany decided she wasn't a cultural fit. When Tamara reached out to Keisha through Sophia's investigation, Keisha agreed to meet and brought with her a story that made Tamara's blood boil. She called me into her office, Keisha explained, her voice shaking with remembered humiliation, and told me that she was restructuring the department and my position was being eliminated. I asked why, given that I'd exceeded all my performance targets. She said it was about cultural fit, that the company needed to move in a different direction. I pushed back and asked what that meant. And she leaned back in her chair and said, "Let's be honest, Keisha. Our clients prefer to work with people who look like them, who share their backgrounds and values. And our clients are mostly traditional. You understand what I'm saying, don't you?" When I said no, I didn't understand, she got more explicit. We need people who represent the brand our clients expect. People who can walk into a boardroom in Dallas or Frankfurt and blend in naturally. I'm sure you'll do great somewhere that's a better fit for your particular strengths. Tamara had recorded the conversation with Keisha's permission, and the recording was devastating. Bethany's voice, that perfectly modulated corporate tone, explaining that black people didn't fit the image TechAero wanted to project to white clients, wrapping blatant racism in the sanitized language of branding and cultural alignment. Combined with the financial fraud evidence, Tamara now had everything she needed: proof of discrimination, proof of self-dealing, proof that Bethany Clarke had lied to the board, violated her fiduciary duties, and broken both civil and criminal laws in her desperate grab for power. But before Tamara could move forward with exposing Bethany, the attack on her son came to fruition. Devin came home from school 3 weeks into Bethany's CEO tenure carrying an envelope from Stanford University, his dream school. He opened it in the kitchen while Tamara watched, and the devastation on his 16-year-old face when he read the rejection letter broke her heart. "I don't understand," Devin said, tears streaming down his face. "I had a 4.0 GPA, I had a 1560 on the SAT, I had the recommendations, I had everything my counselor said Stanford wanted. How did I get rejected?" Tamara held her son while he cried, and then she called Stanford's admissions office with a sick feeling in her stomach. The admissions counselor was professional but clear when Tamara identified herself and asked about Devin's application. "Ms. Washington, I can't discuss specific application details, but I can tell you that we received concerning information from TechAero Solutions about your current professional status and some ethical questions that were raised. The letter suggested there were ongoing performance issues and possible misconduct investigations. When we receive information like that from an applicant's parent's employer, especially regarding ethical concerns, it factors into our holistic review process." Tamara felt rage so white-hot she could barely speak. "Who sent that letter?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "It was signed by Bethany Clarke, identified as CEO of your company, writing in her capacity as a corporate representative familiar with your professional conduct. Bethany had deliberately sabotaged Devin's college application, had used her position as CEO to write a false and damaging letter to Stanford, had attacked Tamara's 16-year-old son because his mother wouldn't quietly accept being destroyed." That night, after Devin finally fell asleep exhausted from crying, Tamara sat in her kitchen and called Harold Brennan at home. "Harold, I need an emergency board meeting. Not next week, not next month. Within 72 hours. And I need it to be mandatory attendance, no exceptions, because what I'm about to present is going to change everything." Harold, to his credit, heard something in her voice that made him agree without asking questions. "Okay, Tamara. Okay. I'll make it happen. But this better be important." Tamara smiled grimly in the darkness. "Oh, it's important, Harold. It's going to end Bethany's career, possibly put her in prison, and prove everything I've been saying for 3 months. So yes, I'd say it's fairly important." The next 3 days moved with the intensity of a thriller movie, all clandestine meetings and whispered phone calls and documents spread across tables in locked rooms. Tamara knew she'd get exactly one chance to present her case to the board, one opportunity to expose Bethany completely before Bethany realized what was coming and tried to cover her tracks. Everything had to be documented, verified, legally sound, and presented in a way that left no room for doubt or deflection. This wasn't about convincing people that Bethany was unpleasant or difficult. This was about proving crimes had been committed, that discrimination was systemic and intentional, that the board had been lied to in ways that violated both corporate bylaws and federal law. The first critical meeting happened Sunday afternoon at Harold Brennan's house, a sprawling estate in Buckhead where he'd agreed to host what he was calling a pre-meeting consultation. Tamara arrived to find Harold, Yvonne Patel, and Gerald Morris already gathered in his study, along with two other board members who'd quietly expressed doubts about Bethany's leadership over the past month, Douglas Freeman, a 62-year-old finance executive, and Catherine Walsh, a 54-year-old former federal prosecutor. These were the 5 votes Tamara knew she had, the 5 people who'd either supported her from the beginning or had grown suspicious of Bethany's methods. She needed to convert at least 2 more from Bethany's 7-vote coalition to guarantee victory. Tamara spent 90 minutes walking the group through everything Sofia Delgado had uncovered, everything Clarence Wright had analyzed, every piece of evidence that pointed to Bethany's fraud and discrimination. She showed them the ownership structure documents proving William Clarke's stake in Skybridge. She walked them through the offshore account and the quarterly $50,000 payments. She played the recording of Bethany telling Keisha Robinson that black employees didn't fit the client image Tech Arrow wanted to project. She showed them the letter Bethany had sent to Stanford deliberately sabotaging Devon's application with false claims about Tamara's professional conduct. With each revelation, the group's expressions shifted from skepticism to shock to barely contained fury. "Jesus Christ," Harold said when Tamara finished, his face pale. "This is major securities fraud." She deliberately hid a material conflict of interest from the board while negotiating a billion-dollar deal. "We could all be held liable for this if it comes out and we didn't act." Catherine Walsh, whose experience as a federal prosecutor gave her perspective on the criminal implications, nodded grimly. "This goes beyond civil liability. Wire fraud, self-dealing, falsifying corporate records, the discrimination case would be open and shut, and if she filed false information with the SEC about the Skybridge deal, that's federal securities fraud with potential prison time. She's destroyed herself." Yvonne Patel, always the analytical one, asked the strategic question. "What's our play here? Do we go directly to law enforcement or do we handle this internally first?" Tamara had already thought through the approach with Clarence's guidance. "We go to the board first. Emergency meeting, present all of this, force a vote to remove her immediately and restore my position as CEO. Once she's removed, we report the financial fraud to the SEC and the Justice Department. But the board needs to act first to protect the company from any claim that we knew about this and didn't move fast enough." Gerald Morris raised the concern everyone was thinking. "Bethany has 7 votes. Even with this evidence, are you sure we can flip enough of her coalition?" Tamara smiled for the first time in weeks. "I don't need to flip all of them. Once they see the criminal fraud evidence, once they understand they could be personally liable for not acting, at least some of them will vote to remove her just to save themselves. And once the vote turns against her, everyone will want to be on the right side. Nobody wants to be the person who voted to protect a criminal after seeing this evidence." The group spent another hour planning the presentation, what order to reveal the information for maximum impact, which documents to emphasize, how to structure the vote to force board members into a clear binary choice between removing Bethany or becoming complicit in her actions. Douglas Freeman volunteered to reach out quietly to 2 members of Bethany's coalition, Richard Caldwell and Preston Montgomery, to give them a heads up that serious allegations were coming and they needed to attend the meeting with an open mind. The message was subtle but clear, the ship was sinking, and they needed to decide whether to jump off or go down with Bethany. Clarence Wright, who joined via video conference, walked Tamara through the legal strategy one final time. "The discrimination case is powerful because you have multiple witnesses, you have the recording, and you have the pattern of black employees being terminated immediately after she took over. The financial fraud is powerful because the numbers don't lie and the conflicts of interest are documented. The attack on your son is powerful because it shows malicious intent and use of corporate position for personal retaliation. Stack them together and you have an overwhelming case." No board can ignore this without exposing the company to massive liability. As the meeting broke up, Harold pulled Tamara aside in his foyer. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I should have seen what was happening. I should have shut down Bethany's whisper campaign from the beginning. I let you down, and I let this company down by not having the courage to call out what was really going on." Tamara looked at the man who'd been her mentor for 12 years, saw the genuine remorse in his face, and decided that forgiveness was less exhausting than bitterness. "You're showing up now, Harold. That's what matters. Help me finish this." He nodded, squeezed her shoulder, and promised, "She's done. We're ending this." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Wednesday at 2 o'clock, 48 hours away. The notice went out Tuesday morning: emergency board meeting. Critical corporate governance issues, mandatory attendance, confidential. Bethany received the notice along with everyone else, and according to Sofia Delgado's surveillance, spent Tuesday afternoon looking visibly worried, making phone calls to her coalition members, trying to figure out what was coming. But nobody in Harold's inner circle said a word. Bethany would walk into that boardroom blind, and by the time she understood what was happening, it would be too late to save herself. Tamara spent Tuesday night and Wednesday morning preparing her presentation with Clarence. 45 slides, each one a nail in Bethany's coffin. Financial documents showing the payments. Ownership structures proving the conflict of interest. Email records of Bethany communicating with Skybridge executives. The recording of her conversation with Keisha Robinson. The letter she'd sent to Stanford. Testimony from 5 other former employees about discriminatory statements and actions. A timeline of every Black or Hispanic employee terminated since Bethany became CEO. SEC filings that should have disclosed the Skybridge relationship but didn't. Every piece of evidence organized, explained, and presented in a way that built inexorably toward one conclusion: Bethany Clarke was a criminal who defrauded the company, discriminated systematically against employees of color, and abused her power to pursue personal vendettas. At 1:30 Wednesday afternoon, Tamara walked into TechAero headquarters for what she knew would be her moment of reckoning. She carried a laptop bag with backup copies of every document, wore her best suit, and moved with the calm confidence of someone who'd been through hell and survived it. Jenna Holloway met her outside the boardroom, gave her a quick hug, and whispered, "Good luck, Ms. Washington. Everyone's rooting for you." At 1:55, Tamara entered the boardroom where 12 board members sat waiting, including Bethany Clarke at the head of the table, sitting in Tamara's old chair, wearing white and smiling like she owned the world. In 10 minutes, Tamara thought, that smile is going to disappear forever. Let's begin. Bethany Clarke walked into the emergency board meeting at 1:58 wearing a white Chanel suit that probably cost $5,000, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from believing you've won and nothing can touch you. She'd spent the past 2 days worried about what this meeting might be about, but she'd ultimately convinced herself it was probably some regulatory filing issue or client complaint, routine corporate governance stuff that had nothing to do with her specifically. When she saw Tamara sitting at the far end of the conference table, quiet and still, she felt a flash of satisfaction. Look at her, Bethany thought, diminished and defeated, probably getting ready to resign. This meeting was probably Tamara's official goodbye, a graceful exit before she was pushed any further down the ladder. Harold Brennan called the meeting to order at precisely 2 o'clock, his face grim and formal in a way that should have warned Bethany something serious was coming. Thank you all for making time on short notice. What we're about to discuss is extremely sensitive and has significant legal implications for this company. I need everyone to understand that what's said in this room today is strictly confidential until we determine our next steps. He paused, looked directly at Bethany, and continued in a harder voice. This meeting concerns allegations of financial fraud, discrimination, and abuse of executive authority. Bethany, you're going to want to listen very carefully. The smile froze on Bethany's face as Harold turned the floor over to Tamara. For a moment, confusion flickered in Bethany's eyes, but then it was replaced by calculation and the first hint of worry. Tamara stood up, walked to the front of the room with her laptop, and connected it to the projection system while every person in that boardroom watched in complete silence. The first slide appeared on the screen: investigation results, financial fraud, conflict of interest, and employment discrimination. Bethany's expression shifted from confusion to alarm as she realized this wasn't routine corporate governance. This was an attack, and she was the target. For the past 6 weeks, Tamara began, her voice calm and professional, carrying none of the emotion roiling beneath her surface. I have been conducting a comprehensive investigation into Bethany Clarke's activities as interim CEO of TechAero Solutions. What I'm about to present to you is not speculation or personal grievance. This is documented evidence of multiple violations of law, corporate policy, and fiduciary duty. Some of what you're about to see rises to the level of criminal conduct. All of it requires immediate board action. She clicked to the next slide, and the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. The second slide showed the ownership structure of Skybridge Corporation, with William Clarke's 18% stake highlighted in red. Tamara let it sit there for a moment, watching comprehension dawn on faces around the table, before she spoke. Bethany has been negotiating a $1.2 billion acquisition of Skybridge's aerospace division. What she did not disclose to this board is that her father, William Clarke, owns 18% of Skybridge Corporation through a series of trusts and holding companies. This is a direct conflict of interest that should have been disclosed before any negotiations began. The failure to disclose this conflict violates our corporate bylaws, Delaware corporate law, and potentially federal securities law. Bethany shot to her feet. That's my father's investment, not mine. I have no control over his portfolio and no obligation to disclose his holdings. Tamara didn't even look at her. Actually, Bethany, you do. Section 7.3 of our corporate governance policies requires disclosure of any material financial relationship between the company and entities in which executives or their immediate family members have significant ownership stakes. But it gets better. She clicked to the next slide, which showed bank records with specific transactions highlighted. These are wire transfers from a consulting account held by Skybridge Corporation to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Tamara used a laser pointer to trace the money trail on screen. Here's $50,000 in January. Another $50,000 in April. Another $50,000 in July. And here's the interesting part: 5 days after each of those deposits, we see wire transfers from the Cayman account to a Bank of America account in Georgia. And who owns that Bank of America account? She clicked to the next slide, showing account opening documents. Bethany and Clarke, account opened 3 years ago, same day as the Cayman account was established. Audible gasps echoed around the boardroom. Preston Montgomery leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Are you saying Bethany was receiving payments from the company she was negotiating with to acquire? Tamara nodded. $300,000 over the past year in what were labeled consulting fees. Self-dealing while using her position as CEO to steer this company toward a deal that would personally enrich her and her family. That's not just a conflict of interest, that's fraud. Bethany's face had gone from tan to pale to a grayish shade that suggested she might be sick. Those payments were for legitimate advisory work I did independently before I became CEO. This is completely mischaracterized. Clarence Wright, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up for the first time. Ms. Clarke, I'm Clarence Wright, attorney for Ms. Washington. I've reviewed every document related to these payments. The consulting agreement between you and Skybridge was signed 8 months ago, 4 months after you became interim CEO. The services described are strategic advice on aerospace acquisitions, which means you were advising the company you were then negotiating with to sell to TechAero. That's textbook self-dealing. Tamara wasn't done. She clicked through slides showing email exchanges between Bethany and Skybridge executives, discussions about how to structure the deal to get board approval, conversations about keeping certain financial details out of official filings, messages that made it clear Bethany was working both sides of the negotiation for her own benefit. Harold Brennan looked like he might have a heart attack. "My God, Bethany. Did you really think we wouldn't find out?" Bethany tried to recover, standing up and attempting to project authority. "This is a witch hunt. Tamara is bitter about losing her position and she's fabricating evidence. These emails are taken out of context. The payments were disclosed to my personal attorney. Everything I did was reviewed and approved." "By whom?" Tamara asked sharply. "Show me the disclosure forms you filed with our legal department. Show me the board resolution approving your consulting arrangement. Show me any documentation that you acted appropriately." Silence. Bethany had nothing, because nothing existed. She'd hidden everything, counting on nobody being smart enough or motivated enough to dig deep enough to find the truth. She'd underestimated Tamara Washington's determination and her willingness to spend her own money on investigators and lawyers to expose what had been done to her. But Tamara wasn't finished with the financial evidence. She had something even more damaging to reveal, something that would make it impossible for any board member to defend Bethany or claim this was all a misunderstanding. "Now let's talk about why Bethany really wanted me removed from the CEO position. Let's talk about the pattern of discrimination that began the day she took over this company." The next slide showed a timeline with names and dates. 11 employees, all black or Hispanic, all terminated or forced out within 6 weeks of Bethany becoming CEO. Positions eliminated, restructuring claimed, but the pattern was unmistakable. 11 people of color fired in 6 weeks, Tamara said, letting the number sink in. Meanwhile, Bethany hired 5 new executives in the same period, all white men, several with direct connections to her father's business network. But the real evidence of discrimination comes from the people Bethany pushed out and what she said to them when she did it. Tamara looked directly at Bethany. "I'm going to play a recording now. This is Keisha Robinson, former business development director, in a conversation with Bethany Clarke 3 weeks ago. Keisha agreed to let me record our interview and to testify if needed." The audio filled the boardroom, Keisha's voice explaining what had happened, and then Bethany's voice, that same professional tone everyone in this room knew, saying words that made several people visibly recoil. "Let's be honest, Keisha. Our clients prefer to work with people who look like them, who share their backgrounds and values. And our clients are mostly traditional. You understand what I'm saying, don't you? We need people who represent the brand our clients expect." Tamara stopped the recording. "That's not all of it. I have testimony from 4 other former employees with similar stories. Bethany told each of them they weren't the right cultural fit, that clients would be more comfortable with different representation, that TechAero needed to maintain a certain image." Yvonne Patel spoke up, her voice tight with controlled anger. "That's explicit racial discrimination. She's saying on tape that she fired people because they're not white." Bethany was on her feet again, desperation replacing calculation. "That's out of context. I never said anything racist. I was talking about client preferences in different markets, about business development strategy. You're twisting my words." Tamara cut her off. "Then explain why every single person you fired was black or Hispanic while every person you hired was white. Explain the pattern, Bethany. Explain why your version of cultural fit and traditional values somehow only includes people who look like you." The room had gone completely silent except for Bethany's ragged breathing. Richard Caldwell, who'd been part of Bethany's coalition, looked distinctly uncomfortable. Preston Montgomery was staring at the table, clearly realizing he'd backed the wrong horse. Catherine Walsh, the former prosecutor, had an expression of cold fury as she realized she was watching multiple federal crimes being documented in real time. But Tamara had one more revelation, one more piece of evidence that would remove any last shred of sympathy anyone might have had for Bethany Clarke. Finally, Tamara said, her voice hardening, "I want to show you what happens when Bethany decides you're her enemy." What happens when you refuse to quietly accept being destroyed? She put up a new slide showing a letter on Tekero letterhead. This is a letter that Bethany wrote in her capacity as CEO to the admissions office at Stanford University. It concerns my 16-year-old son Devin, who applied for early admission. Would someone like to read what our CEO wrote about me to influence my child's college prospects? Gerald Morris, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage, read from the letter projected on screen. This letter is to provide context regarding Tamara Washington, whose son Devin Washington has applied for admission to Stanford. Ms. Washington is currently under performance review at Tekero Solutions due to concerns about ethical judgment and decision-making processes. While I cannot discuss specific personnel matters, I felt obligated to inform your admissions committee that there are ongoing questions about professional conduct that may be relevant to your holistic evaluation process. Gerald stopped reading and looked at Bethany with disgust. You went after her 16-year-old child. You deliberately sabotaged his college application with false claims to punish his mother. Bethany's last vestige of composure shattered. He wouldn't have gotten in anyway, she spat out before she could stop herself. Stanford doesn't want kids who only got where they are because of their mother's diversity points. I did them a favor by giving them the full picture. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. In that moment, Bethany had confirmed everything Tamara had been saying, had revealed the ugly prejudice that motivated her every action, had admitted in front of 12 witnesses that she'd attacked a child to hurt his mother. Several board members looked away in disgust. Others stared at Bethany in shock. And Harold Brennan stood up, his face rigid with fury. Bethany Clarke, you are terminated effective immediately. You are banned from company property, your access is revoked, and you will surrender your credentials before you leave this building. Furthermore, I am directing our general counsel to report this matter to the SEC, the Justice Department, and the Georgia Attorney General's office. What you've done here isn't just wrong, it's criminal, and this board will not protect you. He looked around the room. I move that we terminate Bethany Clarke for cause, restore Tamara Washington as CEO effective immediately, and authorize full cooperation with law enforcement investigations into Ms. Clarke's conduct. All in favor? 12 hands went up. 12-0. Unanimous. Bethany looked around the room, searching for even one ally, one person willing to defend her, but found nothing but condemnation and disgust. She grabbed her purse, her hands shaking, and turned toward the door. But before she left, she looked back at Tamara, hate and disbelief warring in her expression. This isn't over. You think you've won but you haven't. I'll sue. I'll fight this. You're going to regret this. Tamara looked back at her with eyes that held no pity, no satisfaction, just cold finality. No, Bethany. I've already won. And you're going to prison. 2 security guards appeared at the door to escort Bethany out. As she left the boardroom for the last time, her white suit seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, a symbol of the privilege and prejudice that had finally, irreversibly, been stripped away. 6 weeks after Bethany Clarke was terminated and escorted out of Tekero Solutions headquarters in disgrace, Tamara Washington sat in her restored corner office on the 35th floor and watched the sunrise paint Atlanta's skyline in shades of orange and gold. The view was the same as it had been before Bethany's attack, but everything else had changed. The office was hers again, decorated with her grandmother's African art and family photos that she'd reclaimed from storage. The team was hers again, with all 11 wrongfully terminated employees rehired with back pay and public apologies. The company was hers again, stronger than before because the truth had been told and justice had been served. The first thing Tamara did after being restored as CEO was call Gregory Nash at Aero Global and restart the acquisition negotiations. To his credit, Gregory was genuinely apologetic about how he treated her during Bethany's undermining campaign. Tamara, I owe you an apology. I let myself be influenced by gossip and innuendo instead of trusting the relationship we'd built. That was wrong, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't see what was really happening. Tamara accepted the apology with grace, because holding grudges took energy she'd rather spend building something great. Within 3 weeks, the Aero Global deal was back on track. Within 6 weeks, it closed at the original terms. $1.8 billion, creating a combined company worth north of $5 billion. The stock market responded enthusiastically to Tamara's return and the successful acquisition. TechAero's stock price jumped 60% in 30 days, making it one of the best-performing stocks in the aerospace sector. Institutional investors who'd been nervous about the leadership instability breathed sighs of relief. Industry analysts praised the board for acting decisively to remove a fraudulent CEO and restore proven leadership. And Tamara received calls from 3 major industry publications wanting to feature her story, though she declined most interviews because this wasn't about personal publicity. This was about showing that racism in corporate America could be fought and defeated if you had the courage to gather evidence, build allies, and refuse to be quietly erased. But while Tamara's professional life was being restored and elevated, Bethany Clarke's life was collapsing in spectacular fashion. The SEC opened a formal investigation into the Skybridge deal and the undisclosed conflict of interest within days of receiving TechAero's report. The Justice Department followed with a criminal probe into wire fraud and securities fraud. The Georgia Attorney General's office began investigating the discrimination claims and the false statements Bethany had made in the letter to Stanford. Bethany hired a high-powered legal team, paid for largely by her father's money, but the evidence against her was overwhelming and much of it came from her own emails and recorded words. 3 weeks after her termination, federal prosecutors charged Bethany Clarke with wire fraud, securities fraud, and filing false statements with the SEC in connection with the Skybridge deal. The charging documents laid out a scheme to defraud TechAero Solutions and its shareholders by concealing material conflicts of interest while steering the company toward a transaction that would personally benefit the defendant and her family. The potential sentence, up to 20 years in federal prison. Bethany's attorneys tried to negotiate a plea deal, but prosecutors, armed with Tamara's meticulously documented evidence, weren't in a generous mood. They wanted Bethany to face trial and be held accountable publicly for what she'd done. The discrimination charges came separately through the EEOC and civil lawsuits filed by the 11 employees Bethany had terminated. The recording of her conversation with Keisha Robinson became public through court filings, and it went viral on social media within hours. Thousands of people, particularly black professionals who'd experienced similar discrimination wrapped in corporate language, shared the audio with comments about how it perfectly captured the reality of workplace racism in modern America. Bethany's reputation was destroyed not just in Atlanta but nationally, her name becoming synonymous with the kind of hidden prejudice that allows white executives to push out people of color while claiming it's about cultural fit and traditional values. But perhaps the cruelest blow came when Stanford University, learning that the letter Bethany had sent was false and motivated by retaliation, reached out to Devin Washington personally. The dean of admissions called Tamara and asked if Devin would be willing to resubmit his application for review without the tainted letter in his file. 2 weeks later, Devin received a new letter, this one with better news. Stanford was pleased to offer him admission for the next academic year, with an apology for the confusion and an invitation to visit campus. When Devin opened that acceptance letter, sitting at the kitchen table with his mother beside him, Tamara watched her 16-year-old son's face light up with joy and relief, and she allowed herself to cry for the first time since this whole nightmare began. The civil settlements came next. Bethany's lawyers, recognizing they had no defense against the discrimination claims, negotiated settlements with all 11 terminated employees. The terms were confidential, but industry sources suggested the total payout was in the neighborhood of $15 million, money that came from Bethany's personal assets and insurance rather than from TechAero. The company itself faced no liability because the board had acted swiftly to remove Bethany and remediate the discrimination once it was brought to their attention. Harold Brennan, to his credit, implemented sweeping changes to corporate governance and oversight to ensure nothing like this could happen again. Which brings us back to where this story began, a private airfield outside Atlanta on a sunny morning 3 months after Bethany's firing. Tech Aero Solutions had just signed a $22 billion contract with the Department of Defense to develop next-generation aerospace technology, the largest government contract in the company's history and validation of everything Tamara had built. To celebrate and to demonstrate the company's new reach and capabilities, the board had approved the purchase of a Gulfstream G700 corporate jet, top-of-the-line aviation technology worth $220 million, which would allow Tamara and her executive team to meet with clients and partners around the world. Tamara stood at the base of the stairs leading into that magnificent aircraft, the morning sun warm on her face, feeling the weight of everything she'd survived and overcome. She'd been attacked, undermined, discriminated against, nearly destroyed by a woman who believed that white mediocrity deserved power more than black excellence. She'd been pushed out of her own company, humiliated in front of her colleagues, had her son's future threatened, and been forced to fight for months just to prove what she already knew, that she'd earned everything she'd achieved and deserved to keep it. The fight had cost her sleep, peace of mind, money for investigators and lawyers, and a level of emotional trauma that would take years to fully process. But standing there, hand on the railing of a $220 million jet connected to a $22 billion contract, looking across the security fence at the woman who tried to take everything from her, Tamara Washington felt something that made it all worth it: vindication. Bethany Clarke stood on the other side of that fence, released on bail pending her trial, wearing an ankle monitor that transmitted her location to federal authorities. Her designer clothes couldn't hide how much weight she'd lost, how the stress of facing prison time had aged her 5 years in 3 months. Her legal team had tried to keep her away from the airfield, to spare her the humiliation of watching Tamara's triumph, but Bethany had insisted on coming. She needed to see it with her own eyes, needed to witness the final proof that she'd lost everything while Tamara had won. Their eyes met across 50 feet of tarmac and chain-link fence. No words were exchanged because no words were necessary. Tamara could have gloated, could have shouted something about karma or justice or what happens when you underestimate a black woman's determination. But she didn't need to. The situation spoke for itself. CEO versus criminal defendant, private jet versus ankle monitor, triumph versus ruin. Tamara smiled, just a small curve of her lips, and turned toward the stairs. Behind her, she heard a sound that might have been Bethany crying, but she didn't look back. Looking back was for people who still had doubts about the outcome. Tamara knew exactly where she was going. Forward, upward, into a future where her company would thrive and her son would attend Stanford and the woman who tried to destroy her would answer to the justice system for her crimes. The Gulfstream's engines powered up with a sound like controlled thunder. Tamara settled into a leather seat worth more than most people's cars, opened her laptop to review the agenda for her meeting in Washington, D.C. with Defense Department officials, and allowed herself one moment of pure satisfaction. She'd fought back. She'd gathered evidence. She'd built alliances. She'd refused to go quietly or accept the narrative that someone else should have what she'd built. And she'd won not through luck or diversity quotas or any of the dismissive explanations people like Bethany used to diminish black success, but through competence, determination, and a willingness to stand up for herself even when the cost was high. The jet lifted off smoothly, climbing into the clear Atlanta sky, leaving behind the woman on the ground who'd learned too late that racism wrapped in corporate language was still racism, that fraud was fraud regardless of who committed it, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the person you underestimate and attack will turn out to be stronger and smarter and more prepared than you ever imagined. Tamara Washington had been tested by one of the oldest forces in American business. The refusal to accept that black women belong in positions of ultimate authority. She'd been tested and she'd passed, not by being perfect but by being resilient, strategic, and unwilling to accept defeat. 3 months later, Bethany Clarke would stand trial in federal court, would be convicted on 7 counts of fraud and false statements, and would be sentenced to 12 years in federal prison with restitution owed in the millions of dollars. Her father's business reputation would be destroyed by association. Her name would become a cautionary tale in business schools about the costs of discrimination and corruption. But all of that was still to come. On this particular morning, as Tamara's jet reached cruising altitude and she looked down at Atlanta becoming small beneath her, the story was simpler and more satisfying. The woman who tried to steal a black CEO's seat had instead watched that CEO board a jet connected to a $22 billion empire, while she stood behind a fence wearing an ankle monitor, facing prison, and learning what real consequences feel like. Now it's your turn to weigh in on this incredible story of corporate warfare, racism, and ultimate justice. Drop a comment and tell us, have you ever fought back against discrimination at work? Do you know someone who was pushed out of their position because of who they are rather than what they've done? What would you have done in Tamara's situation? Hit that like button if you're inspired by how Tamara refused to back down, subscribe to this channel because we bring you real stories about fighting injustice and winning, and share this video with anyone who needs to hear that standing up for yourself is worth it even when the battle seems impossible. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring about these stories, and remember, your excellence can't be erased by people's prejudice if you refuse to let them write the ending. Keep fighting, keep rising, and keep proving that you belong wherever you've earned the right to be. Tamara Washington's journey teaches us that excellence alone doesn't protect you from prejudice, but documentation and strategic resistance can defeat it. First, always document everything. Tamara survived because she kept records, hired investigators, and gathered irrefutable evidence rather than relying on good faith or hoping truth would prevail automatically. Second, build alliances before you need them. Harold, Yvonne, and Gerald became crucial supporters because Tamara had invested in genuine relationships over years, not just when crisis struck. Third, recognize coded language for what it is. Terms like cultural fit, traditional values, and aggressive leadership style often mask racial bias in professional settings. Fourth, understand that racism in corporate America rarely announces itself with slurs, it operates through whisper campaigns, strategic isolation, and weaponized concerns about competence. Fifth, protect your mental health and your family throughout the battle, because people like Bethany will attack everything you value if given the chance. Sixth, legal preparation matters. Tamara worked with attorneys and investigators who understood both discrimination law and corporate fraud, which gave her case teeth. Finally, never accept defeat quietly when you know you're being targeted unjustly. Tamara could have resigned, taken a settlement, and disappeared, but she fought back and won, creating precedent and accountability that will protect others who come after her. Has workplace discrimination ever cost you an opportunity you earned? Have you witnessed someone being pushed out because of prejudice disguised as business decisions? What's the most important lesson you're taking from Tamara's fight against corporate racism? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because your stories matter and help others feel less alone in their struggles. If this story inspired you, motivated you, or opened your eyes to how subtle workplace discrimination can be, smash that like button to help more people find this content. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories about people who refuse to be erased by injustice. Share this video with anyone fighting their own battles at work, anyone who needs to hear that standing up for yourself is possible and worth it. Thank you for spending your time with Tamara's story, thank you for caring about justice and accountability, and remember, your voice matters, your experiences matter, and you deserve to be in every room where you've earned your seat. Stay strong, stay courageous, and keep fighting for what's rightfully yours. We'll see you in the next story.